This talk may have the distinction of trying to introduce the most unknown figure to you in American church history of any of the biographies we've ever covered, but I believe that it's high time for the name of Lemuel Haynes to be rescued from the scrap heap of history. In this way, my sketch shares the same hope as the first biographer of Lemuel Haynes, Timothy Mather Cooley, who says, writing in 1839, so Lemuel Haynes he died in 1833, so this is now 1839, 6 years later. At least it is believed that the friends and admirers of Mr. Haynes, who often listened to the impassioned eloquence of that living preacher, will all welcome this attempt to rescue his name from oblivion. 6 years later, how much more now? Why should we rescue his name? Why should we recover his life? To whet your appetite, I just want to name one. I want to introduce it in story form. I was asked a fairly pointed question recently in a Q&A concerning racial reconciliation, and the person asking the question knew that I was a convinced Calvinist, so he decided to confront the connection he saw between Reformed theology and slavery. You might remember last year we talked briefly about the fact that Jonathan Edwards owned slaves. It's well known that George Whitefield promoted slavery throughout the southern colonies. So I was asked directly if Reformed theology itself is to blame. That is, if we should abandon the theology of slave owners because their theology was wrong because they owned slaves. Should we reject Reformed theology because of the failure of Reformed thinkers to argue against slavery? I said the problem is not with what Reformed theology itself says, but an inconsistent application of what it says. And this is much in line with what Pastor John has written in Bloodlines, showing how the doctrines of grace really should destroy any form of ethnocentrism. But I wish that I would have just talked about the life of the Black Puritan Lemuel Haynes. I wish that I could have, in that moment, recalled that the first African American to be ordained by any religious body in America in 1785, that he fought against slavery. He was a Calvinist abolitionist, not by minimizing Reformed theology, but by mining it, by being fiercely convinced by it and trying to ruthlessly, consistently apply it. He's a hero of mine because he saw that the freedom of slaves was Reformed theology, further extended, more faithfully applied in America than it had been before. He fought the injustice that he saw not with the borrowed weapons of some secular system of thought, but with the biblical ammunition of Reformed theology. So, let's, without further ado, recover his life and his name. Lemuel Haynes was born in 1753. This is 3 years after Jonathan Edwards got fired from his church in Northampton. Jonathan Edwards died in 1758, so Lemuel Haynes was born 5 years earlier. We find ourselves in West Hartford, Connecticut. There's no United States of America, just a collection of British colonies. A white Scottish indentured servant gives birth to a baby boy. She abandons him because this is the unwanted result of a forbidden crossing of racial boundaries. She was Scottish, the father was African. She abandons him to a man named Haynes and then vanishes. Now, this man Haynes names the boy Lemuel. We don't really know why. One of the biographers, Luke Walker, says, well, perhaps Lemuel, being the biblical name of the king in Proverbs 31, who relayed the instructions that his mother had given him, perhaps this is a jab at his mother for not giving him those instructions, maybe in fact giving him nothing at all. When Haynes was 5 months old, his guardian indentured him to Deacon David Rose, Granville, Massachusetts. In other words, Lemuel's mother gave him his social status in society. She was an indentured servant. He became an indentured servant. We should immediately note that this time of indentured servanthood was unique. This is what Lemuel Haynes says as he assesses this period of his life. Quote, "When I was 5 months old, I was carried to Granville, Massachusetts, bought out as a servant to Deacon David Rose till I was 21. He was a man of singular piety. I was taught the principles of religion, and his wife had a peculiar attachment to me. She treated me as though I was her own child. I remember it was even a saying among the neighbors that she loved Lemuel even more than her own children." Early education for Lemuel came through a small school in the area, family worship, and any opportunity he had at any time to learn. He would sit by the fireplace in the evenings after a day's routine and try to learn as much as he could. And books were scarce, so he had the Bible, he had a Psalter, he had a spelling book, and a book called Young's Night Thoughts. And he made it a resolution, quote, "I make it my rule to know something more every night than I knew that morning." Issues of life and death and eternity were a powerful formative force in his upbringing. So on one occasion, he was, as a young boy, alone in the house during a thunderstorm. And the house began to shake and his soul began to shake with, quote, "a fearful apprehension that the last great day had come and that the world was going to be burnt up." He feared being struck dead and sent directly to hell. In a moment, he suddenly realized, like a thunderclap, the solemn conviction he was unprepared. It would be a fearful thing right now to fall into the hands of the living God. But that was forgotten. And a few months later, he had another brush with death. He was bathing in a river beyond his depth, nearly sank down repeatedly until a friend dove in the water to save him. On another occasion, he was nearly killed by an enraged ox. Haynes had driven him too hard, and the ox turned against him, gave him several wounds on his face and on his head. Haynes had to climb a tree to find safety until somebody that was just passing by could divert the ox's attention. He also recalled a time that an unbelieving neighbor was mocking the faith of Deacon Rose, mocking religion, and this scoffing began to impact him. He began to have doubts and concerns about religion. He was 9 or 10 years old at this point, but then immediately illness took the life of some members of his family, of that guy's family that was mocking. And so what he did was he came to see the connection. He prayed with Deacon Rose about his doubts, and he said, if prayer and religion are needed at death and sickness, then they must also be important in health and in life. All of these events formed him, shaped him. He repeatedly referenced them in sermons and conversations. But something happened in 1775 that gave death a new dimension, not just the scary dimension of death, but the sorrowful dimension, as the death of his mother, Mrs. Haynes, the only mother he ever knew. He called it inexpressible sorrow, bitter mourning, lamentation, how he hated death. But death was an ever-present reality. There were also, in New England at this time, end-time speculations involving the coming of the Northern Lights. So there was the idea that the world would come to an end when the Northern Lights appeared, and this impacted him, quote, "For many days and nights I was greatly alarmed through fear of appearing before the judgment bar of God, knowing that I was a sinner, and I cannot express," he says, "the terrors of my mind that I felt. One evening, being under an apple tree and mourning my wretched condition, I hope I found the Savior. It was a turning point. He got baptized, joined the church in East Granville. That was his upbringing. Now, in 1774, as we move to the next period of his life, his adult life, he was, after being baptized, his indenture ended at age 21, and the revolutionary sentiment in America was growing, so he volunteered in 1774 as a Minuteman. In October of 1776, he joined the Continental Army for the American Revolution. He served from October to November because he got sick, got typhus, and was relieved of duty. He was a lifelong defender of the principles of federalism. He was a Republican. He had a deep fondness for George Washington. He loved the fact that later George Washington, when he died, made sure that all of his slaves were released and supported. War taught him many lessons, but once again, war taught him the inescapable fact of death and eternity. 1776, after being relieved of duty, he came back home, not as an indentured servant, but as a family member. He was in the Rose household, and he would be the one that would be preaching sermons on Saturday evening in preparation for the Sabbath. And he would be the one to read sermons from Whitefield and Edwards and preach them. And on one evening, Deacon Rose was so struck by the power of this sermon. It had a unique energy and passion, and so he asked at the end of it, who wrote that sermon? Was it Edwards? Lemuel said no. Well, was it Whitefield? Lemuel said no. Deacon Rose kept pressing until Lemuel said he had written it. It was a sermon on John 3:3. You must be born again. And at that point, the Rose household and others around him said, you're called to ministry. Lemuel began to take that seriously. The inward call had happened and the external call confirmed by people around him, so he began to prepare for a life of ministry. He was shaped and formed foundationally by the Calvinist theology of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. People said you should go to college, get further educated. He decided to stay there and be trained by two local pastors. He learned Latin from Daniel Farrand and Greek from William Bradford. But more importantly, he sought to imitate the example that he saw in them, not just studying, but apprenticing. And in particular, Farrand appears to be the one that most deeply shaped Lemuel. Quote, in him were blended, this is Daniel Farrand now, the deepest piety and most amusing wit. And such was the structure of Lemuel's mind that he eagerly, readily caught the spirit and habits of his early instructor, in particular, the remarkable propensity for satire and humor that Farrand had. The things that were so conspicuous in the instructor, his biographer said, were then transfused into the soul of the pupil. This was discipleship at its best. Now, there are some great examples as you read through Timothy Mather Cooley's biography of this wit and humor. He used it to great effect. I'll just give you a couple examples here. In old age, he wandered by accident into a party in honor of Democrat Andrew Jackson when he was appointed to the presidency. Now, he was a Republican, remember? Andrew Jackson was a Democrat, so before he could hightail it out of there, he was discovered and urged, make a toast. So he did. He lifted his cup and said, Andrew Jackson, Psalm 109, verse 8. And everybody drank heartily. And only later did somebody bother to look up what Psalm 109:8 says. It says this, let his days be few. and let another take his office. He was also quick to use his wit with his friends. When a friend and fellow minister lost all of his sermon manuscripts in a house fire and was lamenting, Haynes immediately smirked and said, "Dear brother, don't you think that they gave more light from that fire than they ever gave from your pulpit?" We'll see another example soon. 1780, he's licensed to preach. He became a founding member and supply pastor to a church in Middle Granville. On September 22nd, so 3 years later, 1783, Haynes marries Elizabeth Babbitt. She was a white school teacher. He'd first met her when he was counseling her through a time of spiritual difficulty. She was very anxious about her eternal state, and he knew something about that, and he was trying to help her with it. And later, after she became a professing Christian, he began to court her. They married in 1783. They had 10 children. I wish I could just tell you about him as a father and as a husband and their marriage. It is remarkable. 1785, 2 years after marriage, 5 years after he's licensed to preach, he becomes the first African American ordained by any religious body in America. He served for 3 years at church in Torrington, Connecticut, and then March 28th, 1788, he left that church to pastor an all-white congregation in Rutland, Virginia. And he was their pastor for 30 years. We believe he's probably the first black pastor to ever minister to an all-white congregation. 1804, Middlebury College awarded him an honorary master's degree, which was another first for an African American. I want to focus on this ministry, this 30-year ministry in Rutland. The Bidiana Boale says the 3 decades there in Rutland were largely peaceful. There were seasons of revival and seasons of drought. Now, what did his ministry look like? What are the things that drove him? Well, let's start with a sketch of his preaching. He believed with all of his heart in the importance of preaching, especially a Christ-centered preaching that had in all of its ministry and all of its preaching a dual lens of his glasses. He didn't wear glasses, but in terms of his ministry, his 2 lenses of his glasses were sovereignty and eternity. He brought that into everything. So here is, for example, his style of preaching before we get to the substance of it. He was a Puritan, and he took the method of Puritan preaching to take a text or maybe a phrase, and he would state the doctrine from it, and then he would go into the uses of the doctrine, and they would be many uses. And he would be saying now eighthly and ninthly and tenthly. And yet his hearers said, despite the multiplicity of his divisions, he never said eighthly or ninthly without a thought that would richly reward you so that you were waiting for the next one too. Another says, you would be carried along through these several divisions of the discourse as by the charm of a musical instrument. We've come a long way from this when we just talk about, let's make sure we just get the big idea and our congregation can understand that. And he's saying, one idea? What about ninthly and tenthly and driving this home? We don't know much about his style in preaching, except his hand motions. His only hand motion was that he held his Bible in his left hand and he would move that back and forth horizontally while preaching so that everybody could see where his thoughts were coming from. He doesn't seem to have made any eye contact with the people that he was preaching to. It was as if he was staring off into another world, and I think that's exactly what he was doing. His sermons were largely extemporaneous. We only have a few examples of what all of that would look like, but we have an exception with perhaps his most famous sermon, which was extemporaneous in every way. A Universalist preacher, Hosea Ballou, was somehow scheduled through some fluke to preach at Haynes' church while Haynes was away preaching elsewhere. a universalist coming into his pulpit. So what happened here is that Haynes heard about it, and suddenly, when he heard about it, he just shut down the meeting he was in and ran back to his own church. Now, Ballou was proud of how opposed he was to orthodoxy. He said wherever he went, the Orthodox gentry generally scud. He loved opposing orthodoxy. And it mattered to him to do it in a dignified way. So when Mr. Ballou saw Lemuel coming to the meeting, he cordially invited him to make a few comments in response at the end, something that he would regret very much later. Lemuel Haynes declined at first, politely, but Mr. Ballou insisted, and so Haynes said at last he'd be willing to make some remarks. After the message, Haynes got up and preached a sermon of his own. His text is Genesis 3. And the serpent said to the woman, "You shall not surely die." He said, in effect, you have just heard from the voice of the serpent. Now listen to the word of the Lord. In comparing him as a preacher to Satan as a preacher, Ballou loved to think that he was very zealous. He was very busy going everywhere promoting this doctrine. And Haynes said, compared to Satan, he was nothing. Satan is a very laborious, unwearied preacher. He's been in the ministry for almost 6,000 years. And his zeal is not abated in the least. Ballou may regard himself as a popular preacher, but nobody is as popular and commanding attention today like Satan. And Satan was even more of a bold preacher because Satan contradicted the word of God with a bold assertion without any evidence at all. He said, "You will not surely die," and he had no evidence. In fact, Haynes said what Satan was trying to do is say, like Ballou, there's no hell, no punishment. The wages of sin is not death. And if it doesn't exist, why is he trying so hard to make us believe that? Those who were present at the sermon wrote down what they could. But some, when they saw the manuscript later, said some of his best remarks were lost. No one pretends to give an account of the number of editions that were printed, but modern historians say at least 70 to 75 numbers of editions of that sermon were printed. He knew what it was like to rebuke the wolves. And so, in preparing to preach, he said the only preparation for preaching is not just preparing the message, but preparing the messenger. He wanted his soul to be irradiated with the beams of the Sun of Righteousness, getting an unction from him, taught by his word and his spirit, and walk in the light of his countenance. Be smitten with the love of Christ himself. Love to Christ, he said, will make a minister both faithful and fruitful. And when he preached, it was a Christ-centered message always. In fact, when he talked about the wicked, he didn't just talk about a laundry list of sins that they did. He said the central characteristic of the wicked is that they walk in darkness and don't love the glory and light of the Lord. Wicked men behold nothing of the divine glory in his word or in his works. That's what makes them most wicked. And when he preached Jesus, Jesus is always given as the answer to humanity's condition. Quote, "Are men starving? Jesus is the bread of life. Are people in bondage? Christ is anointed to proclaim liberty to the captives, opening of the prison to those that are bound. Are people said to be blind? Jesus is the light of the world, the one who only has the salve for the eyes and can open the eyes. Are people said to be poor? Christ is greater than gold. He was made poor so that they might become rich. Are people naked? Christ has white robes with which to clothe them. He said, he, that is the preacher, will never entertain his audience with empty speculations, vain philosophy, but with things that concern their everlasting welfare, and therefore Jesus Christ and him crucified will be the great topic, the darling theme of their preaching. I love this man. He was Christ-centered in his preaching. He was also Calvinistic. One of his biographers said that the doctrines of grace were the seasoning of all of his sermons. He didn't have sermons on Calvinism. They were all seasoned with the doctrines of grace. In fact, they said he had studied the Bible so thoroughly that he could produce almost infallibly by memory the texts that had a bearing upon the essential doctrines of grace. They had just been transfused into his soul. But he also saw things not just through the light of sovereignty, but the light of eternity. It marked everything about his ministry, his preaching. He said, "Oh, with what zeal and fervor will the preacher speak? Death, judgment, and eternity will appear in every feature, in every word. The weighty things of another world will be in every sermon and in every word." And in his 30-year pastorate in Rutland, he preached over 400 funeral sermons. In 11 years in Granville, he preached 120 funeral sermons. Death and eternity were always present. In fact, the B.D. Anabwale said this, I think exactly right. Yes, life in the Vermont wilderness was fleeting. The question of eternal life was always pressing. Had he wanted to, Haynes could not have escaped the constantly looming figure of death. But here's the secret of his ministry. He didn't want to escape the contemplation of eternity. He embraced it with all of his might. Moving now to the last chapter of his life. After 30 years ministry in Rutland, he was fired. And I wish I could just spend all my time on his farewell sermon there. It was a really painful moment. Haynes, as he remarked upon it, lamented and said, it's as if after 30 years they figured out I was black. He really saw a racial aspect to it, but we shouldn't be simplistic in our analysis of this. It's also true that his political convictions, the winds were blowing now much against them as well. So it seems like there's a series of things that conspire to turn his people against him, and they fire him. But he wasn't surprised. He said, in fact, every sermon should be a kind of farewell discourse. We should preach and act like dying men. And as he reflected upon this, he said nothing in his eternity was changing at all in this moment. You remember Edwards, when he was fired, it said, one of the biographers looking at him, it was as if he was a man that the things of this world could not touch his joy. It seemed like this untouchable joy that could not be grabbed by the temporary things of this world. That's exactly what Lemuel Haynes believed. He believed that his eternity wasn't changing for the worse, but indeed for the better. Because blessed are you, great is your reward when you experience afflictions and trials and persecution. Quote, the ambassadors of Christ have been called to sacrifice everything, property, ease, reputations, their very lives, for the salvation of men's souls. If you cannot sacrifice your reputation, your living, yes, your own life, for the cause of Christ, you have forfeited your character as a faithful ambassador of the Prince of Peace. In fact, he counted it a joy to be numbered among the others that have suffered this way. He had an idea of those that had run the race before him as a Puritan, and he loved them. Quote, "The history of the preachers of the gospel in every age of the world afford distressing evidence in proof of the point before us. The imprisonment of a Rutherford, a Baxter, the sufferings of a Manton, Flavel, Whitfield, and their contemporaries show us this truth. Opposition to the servants of Christ is not an accidental thing. They will not give up the cause, come life or come death. This rendered Luther, Melanchthon, Huss, Jerome, Polycarp, Wycliffe, and 1,000 others invincible to all the flatteries and intrigues of wicked men and devils." He found himself in that great fraternity. Now, don't have enough time to go into the 11 years in Rutland. Let's go right to his final days, 1833. As his homegoing was fast approaching, Christ became bigger to him. I wonder if that can be said of people here. That as eternity gets nearer to you, nearer than when you first believed, that Christ gets bigger. He said, "Christ is my all. His blood is my only hope of acceptance. My pains are great, but blessed be God, they're not forever. I long to be with Christ in heaven. I have been examining myself and looking back over my life, but I can find nothing in myself and nothing in all my service to recommend me at the bar of Jehovah. Christ is my all. His blood is the only hope of my acceptance." And as he was dying, he kept trying to get people with him to see Christ. One friend asked him if Lemuel wanted him to stay by his side. He said, "Oh yes, brother, I want your company for all eternity." He just kept, this was his life, he kept trying to get people to go with him to eternity, to see the weighty things of another world. That's the way that he viewed ministry. In fact, as he thought about the fellowship of the saints, he thought about not just seeing his Lord, which was first and foremost, but the fellowship of the saints. As he was dying, and as he thought about it, he said, "I'm going to see," and he didn't mention his mom, John Owen. He was a Puritan through and through. He passed from this life. He entered the glory, September 28th, 1833. They had a very simple inscription on his tombstone, but later discovered that he had written his own that he wanted. Quote, "Here lies the dust of a poor, hell-deserving sinner who ventured into eternity, trusting only on the merits of Christ for salvation. In the full belief of the great doctrines he preached while on earth, he invites his children and everyone who will read this to trust their eternal interest on the same foundation." That was his life. Now, quickly, let's deal with the lessons that we can learn from him. Again, out of the thousands of things I could say, I want to go back to the two dual lenses of his ministry glasses, sovereignty and eternity. What that meant, because he believed in sovereignty, it meant that nothing that he saw was ever pointless or meaningless. He was always looking for design. He said, if you observe providence, you'll have providences to observe. He believed that with all of his heart. God was always at work. And because he saw things through the weighty matters of another world, he was never hopeless. He always had hope. Things were never pointless. Things were never hopeless. I have to say, I'm amazed by the way that he brought these two things into everything. Just amazed. So think about, for example, how he was an abolitionist as a Calvinist. He had two weapons in the warfare against slavery: Calvinism and republicanism. Now, in republicanism, there's a providence here because he said with Americans founding the way the country was founded, he was just arguing for consistency. He wasn't saying it needs to be something different than what it was meant to be. It just needs to be more what it was meant to be. So he would say things like, drawing parallels between the patriots in the Revolutionary War and the African slaves. Without ever equating their suffering, he said the bitter cup of tyranny and oppression had been tasted by both to one degree or another, and the similarity was unmistakable for him because providentially he had taken part in both. One biographer said his very duality allowed him to see and experience the double meanings of America. If America was indeed a place that would protect the rights of all people to have life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness, then it just needed to work those things out more consistently. And he was never afraid to point out the inconsistency. One sermon after the War of 1812, many white Americans had been taken into slavery by British forces, and of course people were outraged at the thought that Americans would be slaves. And of course, Lemuel Haynes preached a sermon called Dissimulation Illustrated. Dissimulation means hypocrisy. Hypocrisy Illustrated. He said, here's hypocrisy. Excuse me, sirs. I know that you're enraged about those American slaves. What about these American slaves? Our president can talk feelingly on the subject of the bondage of our seamen. I'm glad to have him feel for them. Yet in his own state, in Virginia, there were in the year 1800 no less than 343,696 human beings in bondage for life. In other words, he said, this is hypocrisy. Some slavery matters to us, and others don't. Some slavery of Americans matters, but the slavery of other Americans does not matter, which means it's not slavery that bothers us. It's some slavery that bothers us. And it was a contradiction to the principled republic that he had fought for. But far greater were the Calvinist weapons against slavery. I'm simply stunned by this, how he didn't minimize them, but just mined Calvinism. He started, like all good Calvinists, with the glory of God. He said the divine glory is an object that's the only thing worthy of attention, to display his holy character. That was the design of God in creation. And there were no other beings existing antecedent to the creation to attract the mind of Jehovah. And we are sure that God is pursuing the same thing still, meaning in all of creation, what you're supposed to see is he's displaying his glory. And so he agreed. Yes, it's a great thing to see the glory of God like Edwards did in spiders. It's a great thing to see the glory of God in monarch butterflies. But what about image bearers? How much more do you see the glory of God reflected there? So, in looking at the transatlantic slave trade, I'm simply stunned at the way he argued for this. He wanted to connect Calvinism and the transatlantic slave trade very closely. How different this was than Arminianism. Arminianism could not say, they wanted to absolve God from the evils of the slave trade, so they had to say, in effect, evil snuck one past God. Not so Lemuel Haynes. He saw design in everything, and so he had to ask, what was God's design in the slave trade? Some people thought largely unconverted people from Africa coming over here, having a chance to hear the gospel, maybe they would get converted and God would send missionaries back. Lemuel Haynes went further and said, wait a minute, what about the ongoing presence of former Africans in America? What's God's design there? They're not all going to go back. What is he up to? What's his design? He was always thinking, in other words, not just about abolition, but about post-slavery. Does God have a design for this? And so, what he said was this: that God intended the transatlantic slave trade to bring former Africans here so that in the church you could have both former masters and former slaves being reconciled only by the power of Christ as a canvas to shine the surpassing greatness of the gospel. That's why they're here. or as himself say, that's why we're here. To show a greater glory for the gospel. That's what's supposed to happen. The doctrine of the new birth, preached so powerfully in the Great Awakening, he said, is the only cause for this great evidence of the gospel. In effect, Luke Walker said it well, he said, in effect, Haynes was saying, is your doctrine, Calvinists, of regeneration strong enough to account for this? The miracle that former slaves and former masters could be reconciled and worship Christ together. It may surprise you, it did me. Lemuel Haynes isn't unique in this regard in the history of American abolitionism. All the early black abolitionists were Calvinist, all of them. It wasn't until 1815 that African American authors would begin to declare themselves against Calvinism. And this shift brought about a subtle yet huge, far-reaching change. One biographer said this, quote, between 1810 and 1820, black authors began expressing an understanding of the slave trade and slavery for the first time, not informed by Calvinist providentialism, but free will evangelicalism. The slave trade appeared then not as an ancient sin in which African elites and traders had long been involved, but merely as a modern European American depravity alien to Africa, because the hand of the predestining God disappeared from the slave trade and from slavery. What does this mean? What he's saying is that when you take a reductionistic, one-sided view of the slave trade and say it's only the problem of white Americans and white Europeans, what happens is it makes it possible to romanticize Africa as some pristine paradise that was corrupted only by the wickedness of white, wealthy people. Haynes said there is more than enough wickedness here on every side that needs to be exposed and addressed. The narrative minimizes the real work that God was doing in exposing the cumulative wickedness at work in the slave trade. He saw total depravity everywhere, not just in America, but in every place of the slave trade. And it was unthinkable for him that this somehow lacked divine design. Think about what's happening here in the cumulative, comprehensive Calvinist doctrine that gets painted on this canvas. He said, it is impossible that the ongoing presence of black people in America could be here without any point or purpose, an anomaly or accident of history. He saw a gospel design. So here we see the full expression in this painting, the way that he dealt with this issue of human depravity, divine providence, sovereign design for the sake of God's greater glory through the work of Christ in the gospel. You got all the doctrines there. Total depravity, providence, regeneration, reconciliation accomplished at the cross and applied in the church. That's what he believed God was up to. Now, I pray that you would add Lemuel Haynes to the Reformed fraternity of fellow pastors. It's important because Anthony J. Carter noted that being Reformed as an African American has at times been lonely because the heroes of the Reformation always come up as white European or white American. While this is no reason, obviously, to accept or reject the truth, it does cause one to pause and contemplate the conspicuous absence of non-white voices. Not seeing or hearing overtly Reformed voices within African American history caused me to wonder why. If these truths are so rich and biblical and historical, why didn't Christianity within the African American tradition express them? The absence of voices and faces recognizably like mine, he said, made me wonder, had God skipped previous generations? Decided only to make the glories of the Reformation known to African Americans in the latter half of the 20th century? Then he discovered There had been a long line of learned, passionate, articulate African Americans within the Reformed tradition. He said, once I learned this, I rejoiced in the wisdom and judgments of God, and he revealed to me my lonely days were over. And my point is, let's not just have people like Anthony Carter embrace him into the Reformed fraternity, but just like Lemuel Haynes embraced all of the Puritans and Jonathan Edwards and everybody else into the Reformed fraternity, let us do the same in welcoming him into it, seeing this family together. I just invite you to know a family that maybe you never knew that you had. If you're a Reformed, Calvinist, evangelical. But I also hope, hear me carefully here, I hope that he can encourage you to engage issues of race. Not by minimizing Reformed theology, but by mining it. Not to move further away, as if you have the fear that engaging in racial issues will be a one-way ticket into the open arms of liberalism. Let me just say this. That's a real fear. Doctrinal drift is a real thing. You only have to read the history of the church. Sadly, even I know some churches I could name by name that have gone that route. Openness to racial issues, take them in a liberal route. Yes, doctrinal drift is real. But you should be just as afraid of not obeying Scripture. Just as afraid of not seeing the radical things that Scripture says about no one ethnicity or gender or social status being enshrined as the church, but Christ is all and in all, so there is no barbarian, Scythian, free, slave or free, all are one in Christ. We should be really afraid of disobeying any text of Scripture. We should be really afraid of not going where God wants us to go, because what we know is that secular systems of thought are not going to address this. The best that secularism can do with racial issues is racial tolerance. And you all know that that's not as powerful as racial reconciliation, because you know it certainly sounds different to say, I tolerate you as different versus I love you as family. The church can address these issues with the biblical weapons of Reformed theology, not taking you away from it, but deeper into it. Let's fear both of those things. Just like 2 years ago when we dealt with the issue of the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit, yes, we should be afraid of charismania on the one side, but we should also be afraid of quenching the Spirit. Yes, we should be afraid of going into liberalism, but we should also be afraid of racial apathy. We should be more afraid than anything else of disobeying God and what He calls us to be in the church. Now, I'll close with his thoughts on eternity. This was what hit me hardest, and I felt rebuked most. When you look at his ordination sermons that he preached for others at their ordination, he always saw ministry through the lens of eternity with a special emphasis on the judgment bar of Christ. His letters are saturated with references to eternity. Even when he was talking about public policy, it was always with one eye to another world. But the way that he thought about ministry, he felt like he was always standing on the verge of two worlds. The one that he was in, where everything was temporary and was going to burn, and the weighty things of another world that he was always trying to get people to see. And when he thought about pastoral ministry, he knew he was going to give an account, and he knew the people were going to give an account, and he always saw them together at the final judgment. He didn't think of himself individually at the judgment, but as a pastor, he knew my flock will be judged with me. And you get this in the Apostle Paul, where he can say in 1 Thessalonians 3:8, now we live if you're standing firm. Or Paul can say in Philippians 4, who's our joy and crown? You think he'd say Christ. That's you. 2 Corinthians 11, apart from these other external things, these sufferings, being beaten with rods and stoned and all that, just those external things, I have the pressure of my daily anxiety for all the churches. He saw eternity not just as an individual, but as a pastor and a flock. He said that the work of a gospel minister is to prepare the people for final judgment. That's what it is. Every sermon, every counseling session, he would even say every conversation, you're preparing people for final judgment. He would sometimes wake up at midnight and feel the urgency for prayer and say, how can I rest? How can I sleep when I know so many of my congregation are exposed every moment to drop into hell? He said it is the design of preaching to make all things ready for the day of judgment. He said the minister will study and preach with a reference to the judgment to come and will deliver every sermon as if it were his last, not knowing when the Lord will call him or his hearers to account. He said you never know, so every moment is a final judgment moment. You never know. So a preacher will not come into the pulpit as an actor comes to the stage to impersonate someone or to display his talents, but as one who feels the weight always of eternal things. And so he will strive. Think about this. If every sermon, you're supposed to be preparing every person for final judgment, he said the application is you've got to speak distinguishingly to every type of person in your congregation. You need to know each of them so that you can speak in a distinguishing way that's helping them be prepared. Not just people over here and you've got selective shepherding. You need to think about how do I speak to everyone in distinguishing ways. The awful scenes of approaching judgment will have an influence on the Christian preacher, and he will want every hearer to have his portion of Christ. He will not preach lofty thoughts, therefore, to impress, but say clear things to be helpful. Quote, the pious preacher will endeavor to adapt his discourses to the understanding of his hearers. His ambition is not to say fine things to win applause, but useful things to win souls. This is how he thought about shepherding. They who watch for souls as those who expect to give an account, Hebrews 13:17, will endeavor this, to know as much as they may the state of the souls committed to their charge, that they can always be in a better capacity to do them good. They will point out the errors and dangers that they see approaching. When they see souls taken by the enemy, they will exert themselves to the utmost to deliver them from the snare of the devil. A faithful minister in his life will correspond with his preaching. In his life, he will reprove and rebuke, warning his people even from house to house. The weighty things of another world will daily determine his walk and conversation in every place on every occasion. And so when he was fired from his church, he heard Jesus' words, rejoice, great is your reward. This is how they treated the false prophets. He said, in fact, Jesus will be more glorious, I will marvel more, and heaven will be sweeter because of everything that I'm experiencing. Quote, every pain, every tear, every insult that ministers bear for Christ's sake will secure them a great reward in heaven, Matthew 5:12. The wearisome, tiresome nights that you spend here running your race, finishing your course, will prepare you for a more sweet repose and rest at the journey's end, when the morning will break forth even brighter. He wrote a poem about death as he meditated on it constantly. Oh, meditate on sudden death and ever keep it near. Be ready to resign your breath when you hear the summons hear. We know that we exist today, but yet we cannot tell. But the next moment we must say unto the world, farewell. Heaven won't admit a single sigh, nor feel a twingling pain. Death's empire shall in ruin lie and never rise again. So Lord, guide us by thy counsels here, that when we come to die, angels, our precious souls, may bear up to thy throne on high. I wonder, if you're in ministry, how do you conceive of your relationship between you and the church that you pastor? Do you think of final judgment only individually? Is your heart so bound up with your people that it just can't be separated? Like it was said of Isaac, that his whole soul was bound up with Jacob, Joseph. Here, when Lemuel Haynes thought about eternity, he didn't just see himself there, he saw his flock there. The most moving moment every year for me as a minister is at our January business meeting. When I read the names of those that have passed from this earth the previous year and entered into glory, and I always read to the church Mark 12:26, where Jesus rebukes the Sadducees for their unbelief with the resurrection. Jesus says, as for the dead being raised, haven't you read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? Meaning he didn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong. So when I read the names, I know that Jesus calls his sheep by name. I know that nobody can snatch them out of his hand. So when I read their names, I don't just read Marlene Johnson. I read, God is the God of Marlene Johnson. When I read through the names, I remember they're not dead. They're more alive than ever before. And in my heart, it is so happy to say, safely home. This one. When I look at people in my flock, I want to get them to that moment of the funeral where I can say, safely home. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save, and fit it for the skies. That's what pastoral ministry is. Every sermon, every conversation, every interaction, am I preparing them well? I love them much when I prepare them well for eternity. Let's pray. Father, it was said of Jonathan Edwards that he had a different set of eyeballs. Eternity was stamped on his eyeballs. Lemuel Haynes was like that. God, I want that. I want those eyes. I want to see everything through the lens of your sovereignty and everything through the pressing lens of eternity. To never see things as pointless or hopeless, but to see all things as purposeful, hopeful, preparing people, including ourselves, for final judgment. In Jesus' name, amen.